Welcome to today's lecture, Artful and Joyful Learning, How to Compose and Teach Beginner Harp Music. Today we will cover 4 characteristics of good beginner harp pieces. We'll then talk about how you can prepare your student to learn pieces, and then there'll be a hands-on activity. If you do this activity, please email me and I will give you feedback, no matter whether it's a week after I make this recording or a couple months after. I'd love to hear from you and get connected. So first, the 4 characteristics of good beginner pieces. The first characteristic is an agenda, a specific goal that the piece should teach the student. We'll begin by listening to a piece called Canoe on the Lake. This is from a piano method called Succeeding at the Piano by Helen Marlaise. This is a method I greatly admire and use with my piano students. And we'll listen to this piece and then notice how Marlaise introduces the new concept. The new thing a student is learning in this piece is this finger pattern 5-1-3-2-1. It's related to a 5-note scale, but it requires just a little bit more finger independence. Notice that Marlaise does include scales, both 3-note and 5-note, in this piece. And also notice that this piece is not repetitive. You would not call it an etude, and yet she manages to include an exact repetition of the new finger pattern. Here are some key takeaways. Introduce 1 to 2 new skills in a piece. Those skills should build on what the student already knows, and it's extra helpful if those previous skills are also included in the piece. And then finally, the new skills are repeated. These 3 characteristics make for a great agenda. So how can we tell the agenda of a harp piece? The answer is to think in terms of micro levels of difficulty. A heightened sense of awareness of levels of difficulty will allow us to pick music with an agenda specific to the needs of our student. Let's practice thinking about these micro levels of difficulty with an activity. We'll first focus on note reading, followed by rhythm, and then technique. So first with note reading, which of these examples is harder and why? See if you can list a few reasons. Go ahead and pause the recording and take as much time as you need. Here are some categories I use to analyze the level of difficulty of note reading. First, look at the pitches that are involved. I'm assuming you agree with me that this example A is harder than our example B. And one of the reasons is there are more pitches that the student has to find. A student may not have learned this low G yet. So it's important to be aware of which pitches has our student learned and which ones are new for them. Another category is notation. In our example A, the fact that the right hand plays bass clef may be challenging for a student. they've certainly learned middle C and E and C before, but the way it's notated makes it slightly more difficult. Next, look at the density of notes. Compare the first two measures of these examples. Even though there are the same number of notes played, in our first example, there are 5 different pitches the student has to find, while in the second, only C and F. So there's a higher density of notes in these measures. In our third measure, the student plays notes at the same time. Another way notes can be more dense. And so the student has to find many more pitches. Finally, look at the intervals. If these last 3 dyads were all thirds, that would be easier for a student, but in this case, there's a third, followed by a fourth, followed by a sixth. So also be aware of what intervals are included in the piece. Let's do a similar exercise for levels of difficulty in rhythm. Pause the recording and find some reasons why one example is harder than the other. Here are some aspects of rhythm to consider. First, the basic rhythmic values. In example B, there are some eighth notes, while example A has merely quarter notes and half notes. But there's other aspects of rhythm too. Consider small rhythmic patterns, typically about a measure long. In measure 3 of example B, this rhythm does not include a note on the stronger third beat, so a little syncopated rhythm. Compare that to the first measure of example A. Both examples just have quarter notes and half notes, but this third measure of example B is just slightly harder. Also consider large rhythmic patterns. You'll notice for example A, this 2-measure pattern gets repeated. Well, in example B, every measure is different. Once the student is playing hands together, consider rhythmic values, small rhythmic patterns, and large rhythmic patterns in relationship to the right hand doing one pattern and the left hand doing another. Finally, let's consider micro levels of difficulty for technique. Pause one last time and think about why one example may be more difficult than the other. Here are some aspects of technique. First, what finger pattern is being used? It's easy to think that because a student has learned to play with 4 fingers, they can play any pattern with 4 fingers. But let's think about how some finger patterns are harder than others. Hopefully your student plays scales every day. So this example B should be second nature to them. 4 fingers up, 4 fingers down with all steps. Compare that to this 1-3-1. In order to place to the third finger, the student has to make sure that that second finger is tucked in, and then the student has to reach up to a thumb. So a more difficult pattern. Also notice what shapes are included. At the beginning of example A, the student places 4 fingers, just as in example B, but there's a gap between second and thumb. And the student will need to learn what this feels like. Next, think about what leaps you find in a piece. And we have one at the end of this example. Leaps are especially challenging to new beginners because they are so reliant at looking at the strings to get those leaps. And so it's a new skill for them to be able to look at the music, look at the harp, and look back to get a leap. So another thing to be aware of when we're analyzing the difficulty level. And then finally, consider any special techniques that may be involved, whether it's PDLT or a fancy type of glissando. So we have discussed finding the agenda of a piece. And another great characteristic of beginner pieces is intrinsic motivation. While stickers and prizes can provide motivation for beginner students to practice, the very best motivation is intrinsic, meaning that it comes from the music itself. Two things provide intrinsic motivation. First, students love pieces they can play. They latch on to pieces that they are confident playing. And I'll often hear a student playing a piece even after we've moved on from working on that piece in lessons because they can play it and they love playing it. Here's another aspect of intrinsic motivation, and that is that students like pieces that sound good. So our first aspect related to finding that perfect agenda for a student so they learn it well and are confident learning it. Next, let's listen to a piece called A Jar Full of Stars and notice how she makes this piece motivating for students to learn. This piece is also from Helen Marlay's method, Succeeding at the Piano, from her level 2A. When I first encountered this piece, I saw all the scales and thought, which student is going to want to learn this piece? This looks boring. But then, as I became familiar with this piece, I saw all the interesting things Marlay's does, and I've taught it multiple times, and students love this piece. One thing Marlay's does is to include chords with a different texture. While the scales are legato and all connected, Marlay's inserts these pianissimo, staccato, energetic chords. She also includes grace notes, which are not technically very hard for pianists, but add a lot of fun. Marlay's also plays around with a variety of registers on the piano. Notice all the places where the student plays up an octave, and then at the very end, 2 octaves higher. Another way to add interest while not making the piece more difficult. One last thing Marlay's does is add this coda at the end, where the student holds down the pedal. It's just one new measure for the student to learn, and then it's repeated 1 octave higher and 2 octaves higher, adding a nice touch, coda at the end. So how can we look for motivating harp pieces and include characteristics in the pieces we compose? We also can include different textures on the harp and utilize all of our different registers. Students love playing the very lowest note on their harps. Another thing that students like is catchy melodies, especially when they're within the vocal range of the student. They also like easy patterns that can be played fast. Even if it's a repetitive pattern, if it's fast and flashy, it feels impressive and exciting to play. And then include all of those fun special effects that we have on harp. A gliss at the end makes any piece exciting. So great beginner pieces have a clear agenda. They're motivating. A third characteristic of good beginner pieces is the inclusion of a teacher duet. Let's consider all the benefits a student gets from playing a duet with their teacher. The most obvious one is ensemble skills, and those are important. But there's some others as well. One of the biggest ones is developing the student's rhythm. Let's listen to Medieval Night. This is a piece I composed, and it's from Play With Me Level 1. At this point in my method, students are just beginning to play hands together. You'll notice whenever the left hand and right hand play together, it's on a downbeat and it's always the same pitch. Notice what rhythmic patterns the student hears when the teacher plays along. Here's 2 half notes against a dotted half quarter rhythm. And there's also the rhythmic pattern of 4 quarter notes against that same dotted half quarter rhythm. There's an important concept in piano pedagogy called the thing before the sign. And the idea is that students internalize aspects of music that they're not yet capable of playing. So the thing is some aspect of music before the sign, seeing it on the page and learning how to interpret a rhythmic pattern or a harmony. Teacher duets allow students to internalize rhythms that they're not yet capable of playing themselves. And then a year from now, when the student is playing hands together, the student's ear will already know this rhythm and they'll be able to learn their pieces well. A similar thing applies to musical styles and genres. With beginner pieces, there's only so much you can do with genre and style when the student's playing one note at a time. But the teacher part can fill out harmonies or create a particular style, once again developing the student's ear such that when they encounter these same harmonies later, they will already be familiar with it. So developing your student as a musician as a whole. Going back to rhythm, one other practical aspect is it helps students to not rush whenever they have a long note. They have to wait for that teacher note before joining in again on the next downbeat. A fourth benefit of a teacher duet is building students' performance skills, mostly in helping them not pause and to keep on going in the middle of a piece. most of my students do not naturally keep on going. And I find it more effective to say, let's play this duet together. If you get off, join me when you can, rather than saying, don't pause, keep going. And when the student is playing with the teacher, they are so motivated to keep going and make it an actual performance, as if they're on stage. So our third characteristic was teacher duets. Finally, let's talk about the aesthetics of a piece. I have two examples here, and I'll give you a moment to think which one would be more attractive for a student to learn and what makes it that way. Here are some characteristics of aesthetics to be aware of. Font size is especially important for young students. Young students' eyesight is still developing, and they're learning to recognize these new aspects of music notation. So a large font size, as you see in my example B, makes it easier for students to learn a piece. This in turn builds their confidence, that it provides them the intrinsic motivation to learn and practice the piece. Fingerings are also beneficial at this level. Often students don't even realize that they play a passage with a different fingering every time they play it. And so it's helpful to have it written out for them. My philosophy is to include fingerings and brackets for placement the first time a pattern is encountered. That way the student has clear direction how to practice the piece. But if that same pattern is encountered later in the piece, as it is in our measure 3, even though the notes are different, here I'll give the student an opportunity to apply what they are doing in the first measure. And finally, don't underestimate the power of artwork. For my piano students, when they flip through their books, every page has a picture on it, and I'll sometimes let them pick one. And pretty much all the time, they will pick a piece based on what that picture looks like. They'll want to play the rocket piece or the pretty kitten. And so that's another aspect that makes our music attractive for students to learn. So we'll move on now and talk about how we can prepare our students to learn a piece. There are many activities you can do when introducing a piece to your student. The goal is that you prepare your student to learn it correctly from the first week, rather than assigning a piece and having a correct mentality. We're going to have a prepare mentality. Here are 3 activities that are some of my favorites, and there are many, many more. Let's listen to a piece from my level 2 of Play With Me called Coming Home. And I've also included the teacher part in this recording, though all you see on the page here is the student part. here are some activities that I would do with a student to prepare them to learn this piece. First, I would find a way to create a technical exercise, an exercise for the technical challenges. In this piece, the student is learning the interval of a fourth. Here there's a 3-finger pattern with a fourth between the A and the D, second and thumb. And then later there's a similar pattern but adding the 4th finger as well. So here's a series of steps I would take with the student. First, I would have them play a scale of fourths. So put 2nd finger on C, thumb on F, play the notes together, and just go up in a scale. Next, I would play a game that I call place, check, play. And I would have the student place, but this time without looking. Then I would have the student check to see if they got the correct interval. And if it's correct, I would have them play it. And if it's not correct, have them adjust and then play it. That check step is really important because if the student did not place the interval correctly, you don't want them to reinforce that muscle memory. My third step would be to repeat steps 1 and 2, the scale and then place, check, play game, but using the actual pattern found in this piece. So have them add that 3rd and 4th finger and this time play place, check, play with the 3rd finger, 2nd finger, thumb, step, 4th. See if they can place it, see if they got the pattern right. You can either have them block it or play it 1 note at a time as written in the music. Another challenge of this piece is the dotted half notes, holding them for the correct length of time, especially since they're preceded by 8th notes. Students will tend to rush and not hold them long enough. And my goal is for the student to feel the rest as energy rather than as passive time. And so one way to help with rhythm or with phrasing is to add words. And this can often be effective as an intro step before you have students just count it. We always want to eventually reach where students can just count and play, but here's a good intro to that. For these last couple of notes, I came up with the words coming home, hooray, coming home. And we'll do that in rhythm. On the rest, the student will feel energy as they say hooray. So it will sound like this. First, the student will just say the words, copying me. Coming home, hooray, coming home. And then I would have them say those same words while they play the notes. And that can transition to counting 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. One final exercise I might include in this piece is saying note names or counting the rhythm out loud. Find whatever is hardest for the student and having them say that out loud is magical. So in this case, at the opening, they are working on these leaps. So they're going up the octave and then up again. And so it might help to get them more familiar with the notes so that they can just focus on that leap. So I might, before they've even played it, I'll have them identify the notes, just one after the other, and then I'll have them say it in rhythm. D, E, F, D, E, F, G, A, D. And notice that for the purpose of this exercise, I did not include the word sharp for F sharp. The more important part of this exercise is to have 1 syllable per note. And they will know that the note is sharp. I'll have the student say or teacher, how can they do that? It's too much to say. Just leave off those F sharps or F flats, just say F, and the exercise works really well to help students learn notes or rhythm, whatever is challenging them. So there's some ideas. I want you to keep thinking about other activities that you might use to introduce your students to pieces you love teaching. We'll now do a hands-on activity. So this is your homework of the lecture. And the activity is to compose a pedagogical piece, thinking specifically of the things we learned. What is your piece's agenda? The agenda could be any of the micro levels of difficulty that we discussed. A new rhythmic pattern, introducing a new notes or finger pattern. Pick something specific and see if you can keep that agenda throughout your piece. Introduce it, repeat it, and have that be the piece's specific goal. And then the second part of this exercise is to think, what exercise could you do to help prepare the student to learn your piece so that they go home very confident knowing how to practice it and they'll learn it well the first time. If you do this exercise, please email it to me. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.